through motor learning that, through these environments that you're going to establish.
So welcome, Beth.
Yes, my name is Beth Fisher, and I'm also on faculty in the Division of Biokinesiology and Physical Therapy. I have a joint appointment in the Department of Neurology, but I don't, you have more than a joint appointment. You have actually...
Well, my appointments are just archivists, so they're students, but I'm not paid.
I see, yeah, I'm not paid by the Department of Neurology. And I have a clinical background. I was a physical therapist. I worked at Rancho Los Amigos Medical Center for 14 years. And I think what drove me to leave the clinic and get my PhD was more than just that my life wasn't painful enough and I had to figure out how to make it more painful. No. Was that I kept having these remarkable experiences with my patients, mostly patients with stroke, traumatic brain injury, and it was this ability to recover beyond what you would ever predict. And that was when I thought I've got to go back to school and learn everything we could possibly learn about the brain, and then I'm going to be that much more effective in how to facilitate those kind of neuroplastic responses. But mostly just found out how complicated the system is and how we don't really know very much at all. But I have a lab that is called the Neuroplasticity and Imaging Laboratory, where we're primarily using transcranial magnetic stimulation, which I'll talk to you about, to answer questions related to the brain changes that occur with skill acquisition in both neuropathologic populations as well as athletic populations, people learning new skills sort of across the board. Okay. So I'm going to start by showing you, and sorry, it's sort of dark, but this is a patient with Parkinson's disease. This is someone that is further along than, this is someone who is more severe, who's probably had the disease for over 10 years at this point. You don't actually see freezing, but you do see what's called start hesitation and kind of a festinating gait, where he's mostly moving with very short steps. Cadence is generally pretty high with these people. Oh, sorry. Can you see him? Mm-hmm. Kind of. Is there a way to fix that? It's really clear on here.
Cannot make it, the projector doesn't have good contrast.
Yeah, sorry. I can send you the videos too.
Okay.
You could, well, you can see it a little bit. This is very, very typical. Now, for someone who is earlier in the disease process, what you would see is observationally what you might detect when they're walking is lack of arm swing on one side. And that might be all. And often it's the case that people observing someone with Parkinson's disease notice that. And that's what brings somebody in to see a neurologist, and they get the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. But so the gait characteristics change over disease severity to where, let's see, at least you can see the start. And you can see some of the things James talked about. Watch as he approaches the doorway. He has that, that start hesitation where he really has to almost like figure it out all over again. Interestingly, what you'll see with people, again, using a cane, he's not loading through the cane. He's not unweighting. If the people are falling, not because they have weakness on one side and they have to support themselves through a cane, he's probably largely using that cane for to provide some kind of auditory or visual cue. A lot of times people will have the cane and just tap it, and you can see he's like holding it up, or they'll even kick it, but it provides him some information that keeps him moving forward. So does that make sense? You'll see patients with stroke will use a cane to basically substitute for a hemiparetic side, versus people with Parkinson's disease might use a cane more to provide some of that cueing.
How is that helpful if they're just doing for sound? Like, it's just a...
It's the same kind of thing as like putting a line on the floor and having them step over. It's just, it's again, a cueing.
It's just self-cueing?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna do this real quick because
No
I'm
problem.
seeing that it's missing a color.
Oh, okay.
Perhaps, maybe, I don't know if it's the keyboard or if it's the frequency it's connecting to.
Well, that would be good. See, I don't know this kind of stuff.
Just to see if it's.
Oh, so maybe,
See, now it's very bright.
oh, maybe that's the, okay.
Oh,
Oh, look at you. See, I can't do stuff like that. Huh?
Can't turn off that half engineering brain.
I love
Always.
it. I wish I had some of that brain. But, okay, so
Alright.
now you can definitely see.
Yes.
So, these are some very common characteristics. Then, no arm swing, small steppage gait. You can't see because of his pants, but he's likely in knee flexion, trunk flexion, and just walking is no longer progression over a stable base of support. Walking is lifting the legs and moving forward with just frequent steps. Oh, this is great. I gotta learn what you did. So, and you could see that, as James talked about, he's very much impacted by changes in the environment. So when he goes through a door, when he has to make a turn, it's not like he can do that in a fluid motion. He has to stop and turn and, start over again. Okay, so this is the bad news. This is very typical of what you see with patients with Parkinson's disease, but this is really the good news. The whole concept of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the mechanism by which the brain encodes experience and learns new behaviors. Now, I had a whole discussion about neuroplasticity, but I'm wondering, just based on some of the comments that I've heard, is this a topic you feel really comfortable with? So you've been through this discussion.
A little bit.
A little bit. So we don't need to belabor it much. But here's a question I have for you, and this again comes like right off your the syllabus. Why is it important to consider current perspectives of neuroplasticity for the design of interactive, entertainment-based products that aspire to have a positive impact on human health and happiness? So why should this group really consider current perspectives of neuroplasticity and how to drive it?
Because if we kind of get a grasp on that, understand how that works, we can understand how to design interface and experience that promotes either targeted or just very general plasticity. That's how I approach it.
Yeah, I mean, it almost is a question that answers itself. I mean, but I absolutely.
well, on the flip side, it also makes us aware of kind of how much effect we can have and how much potentially damage we could do if we're not thinking carefully about how we're affecting people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for us especially, because we don't live this, it is important to understand that effect in terms of how much effort we have to make, because that translates to a depth, length of an experience. So there are experiences in interactive entertainment that are more about developing an aha moment of insight, which is a different kind of thing, versus these experiences that could be driven by something very meaningful for you to acquire skills and get to a place of neuroplasticity that is, transformative for your quality of life.
Yeah, and I think that's where the field of motor learning, and again, tell me if you have a lot of knowledge of that field of study, because I think that's where hopefully people like myself can provide insight from that research to say, we know that if you manipulate this practice in this way, it enhances the learning of motor skills. And so that, is that an area you also?
We know nothing about
Okay, well, there you go. In a general sense, the way I would answer this question is basically what you all said, is that because plasticity underlies all learning and what we're about for, just being involved in promoting human development and the best possible outcomes, is that I need to really understand plasticity because I'm teaching motor skills. I want people to improve in their ability to, perform what they need to, what they want to in the environment. So whether that's playing basketball or just learning an exercise technique or, being a very skilled dancer, plasticity really underlies all of these behaviors. What do you know, how many of you know about, or how many of you know that the 1990s, were designated the decade of the brain? So you know all of that. Okay, good. How many of you were actually born during the decade of the brain? That's the part that I realize I've been having to ask recently.
Yes.
And it's pretty depressing. But because that might seem, for those of you born within the decade of the brain, might seem like it was forever ago, but it is really a very short time. And the reason why it's so important is that this was really, I see this as an important event that established this area of research as being one of the most important topics that we're addressing in neuroscience and rehabilitation. But this was a presidential proclamation. Did you know that you could actually read an entire presidential proclamation? You can go online and, not that you want to, but this was the part of the presidential proclamation associated with dedicating the 1990s as the decade of the brain. And
the decade before was what decade? Do all of you remember? The war on drugs, right? So it was about addiction. Then we went into the brain. Right now, I think now we're doing war
back to addiction.
war on cancer.
Oh yeah.
And then the decade of the mind.
Yeah.
So
Chris Powers would love to have a decade of the brain because
they're flags. They're just flags.
well, I mean, again, as I was listening to the group, I said, they know all about neuroplasticity, so I don't really have to make a strong case for this. But
we know something's happening. We want to know how to make it happen well.
But it's this is what I think is so exciting about this effort to bring together your group with helping people with Parkinson's disease solve this problem that is, hugely impacts their quality of life and just their ability to function. So I had a couple of quotes from, kind of a lay person. Again, maybe some people weren't even born at the time that this Newsweek article came out. But I think what was really critical about the decade of the brain research was not only was a ton of money poured into NIH and trying to understand how the brain worked, but this tremendous, just the knowledge that came out, primarily this recognition that neuroplastic changes in brain repair can occur over an individual's lifetime. It's not just something that is for the infant that's developing, but we really have to understand what it is that we need to do to promote that. So I was going to share the results of this one study because I think this is an important aspect to, again, what we need you to design, is that these are some of the things we know, that the brain is not responding to just generating more force in muscles or getting stronger. The brain is responding to skill acquisition. So we have to make, whatever we develop has to be about promoting a skill acquisition process. So in this study, what they did was they had 3 groups. They had a skill acquisition group, they had a strength training group, and then they had a control group. The skill acquisition was basically this task where the individual was doing a tracking task, and there were various templates. They had to essentially match their movement to the template track. And what they showed as their as evidence that skill was developed is that this is on the y-axis motor performance, so the deviation, their pattern from the template pattern, and you can see that their error decreased over practice. So they actually got more skilled. The strength training group had a pretty extensive bicep strength training where actually they had their arms supported and they were lifting weights, and they controlled for the number of flexion extension repetitions between the skill and the strength training group. But this just shows that there were really these task-specific changes when they looked at, so here's your strength training group, the skill group, and the control group, both with MVC and 1 rep max. So indices of strength changes, and you can see that there is a post effect of the intervention only in the strength training group. So we have, the skill training group showing improvement in skill, the strength training group only showing improvement in strength. So do you know much about transcranial movement? You do. You already know about TMS. Okay.
Only one
I didn't
person.
know exactly what to prepare.
The rest of us don't.
Okay, only one person.
Yes.
I'm just very enthusiastic about
Okay.
this particular
Well, again,
Do you have a
topic.
question about the previous slide?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll go back to your slides. This one. Okay. What is your question?
Regarding improvement in strength, well, doesn't strength also indirectly help enhance a skill? Like if they have the strength, they can implement that thing better.
Yes and no. I mean, I sound like Jake's a little bit. And I keep, I'll flip with my clinical hat on and my research hat on, but we have seen people that have the force generation capability. There's no problem in terms of every test of strength that we utilize, they are strong, but they still use a faulty movement strategy and have pain or some associated deficit. So you can see the sufficient strength to achieve a task, but the movement is incorrect. Now, the flip side of that is you do need certain resources to be able to manage the weight of your body against gravity. You certainly need a certain amount of force production capability. So, but too many therapists rely on the fact that if I just improve those resources, they'll be fine. And what you see is people work on giving people strength exercises, they get stronger, they still move incorrectly.
So think of dancers, right? Dancers could be lean, like with very small muscles, or they could be very, very, built, almost like bodybuilders. But whatever task they have to perform, they have to have learned to do very well, regardless of their strength. Now, they might be able to last longer, jump a little bit higher, or carry more people or whatever based on their strength, but that's not as relevant to their ability to perform a complex task that requires, a different kind of part of your brain, right? So yes, you need a minimum level of muscle to jump up in the air and land and not hurt yourself, but that, being able to practice a grand jeté, like run across and do this on the floor, is not so much a physical task, it's a mental task, because you have to defy gravity and understand your own space of, how much space you take in space, and how to plan it so that you don't fall in the middle of it or fall into someone, right? So there's a lot of things that you learn in that, which that first task was reductive in trying to measure, right? It's a very simple task, but learning to stay within the lines done before is a very simple task you have to master, even if it's like a stupid task. It's still a new task, right? A grand jeté might seem like a stupid task to a lot of people also, right? But yes, you need to be able to move your hands to do it, but how strong you are in moving your hands does not change the fact that you still need to know the task very well. So that's what you're trying to get to.
Exactly.
Okay.
And these, when you're talking about a task, you're not talking about a single muscle. You're talking about a group of muscles that are acting together, spatially, temporally, synergistically, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just the force production of a single muscle. It's being able to perform that synergistic action.
What's MVC and IRM?
So that's one rep max is, these are basically measures of similar things. 1 rep max is, think of a weight trainer. It's the amount of weight they can lift one time, just like the maximum amount of weight that can be lifted. MVC is maximal voluntary contraction. So you'll actually apply resistance to somebody's contraction and, basically see what level they break at, essentially. Okay. So their measure of brain plasticity was looking at cortical excitability changes using a method called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is, like I said, what I use in my lab. And TMS is the use of powerful, rapidly changing magnetic fields to induce electric fields in the brain by electromagnetic induction without the need for surgery or external electrodes. So this is basically a diagram, a schematic of the basic principles of TMS. Essentially, there is a brief current that's passed through the primary coil, and that induces a time-varying tangential magnetic field, which then induces a current in the secondary coil, which is parallel to the other current, equal in amplitude in the opposite direction. Well, in the case of TMS, that secondary conductor or secondary coil is the human brain. And if you are over motor cortex, which has direct connection to the muscles in the body, and I stimulate over an area of motor cortex, basically I can get what's called a motor evoked potential. And that's from the EMG that's over the muscle that I'm stimulating cortically. All right. Now, what that motor evoked potential tells us is it tells us about the excitability of the system. One of the measurements, primary measurement we'll look at is the amplitude of that motor evoked potential. So that is basically the outcome measure they utilized in this study. So again, not to belabor this, but just really quickly, this is called an input-output curve. So they looked at the stimulation of the brain over multiple intensities. That's what this is. They just kept turning up the intensity, and you'll see this, what's called the input-output curve. And they're looking at the size of the motor evoked potential. And this was looked at baseline, 2 weeks, and 4 weeks following the skill training or strength training or nothing. And big picture, again, what you see is that only in the skill training group do we see changes in cortical motor excitability. Because, these basically are overlapping. So the bottom line was basically that the changes in excitability were related to a skill acquisition process. So this is not from that same study, but multiple studies have basically shown this same thing. We thus propose it is not isolated physical activity that is good for the brain, but physical activity in the context of cognitive challenges. Okay, so this is the rest of the quote associated with this, this article written by Jeff Klein and Teresa Jones. And that is that neuroplasticity is the mechanism by which the brain encodes experience and learns new behaviors, but it is also the mechanism by which the damaged brain relearns lost behavior in response to rehabilitation. So again, whether that is, walking on uneven surfaces and learning how to do that, or working on controlling yourself against gravity and core strengthening, or just learning how to walk again after a stroke. Plasticity underlies the learning associated with all of these tasks.
Does the cognitive challenge, or how similar must the cognitive challenge be to the physical activity in the first place? Is it just the mere fact that somebody is cognitively challenged?
Well, okay, let me see if I'm getting this right. I think we need to think about specifically learning from a motor learning perspective, procedural learning, which is really unconscious processing. So I am not really thinking about the learning aspect of it. I'm just thinking about solving the motor problem. So if I go to pick that up, I'm looking at the position of that in relation to where I'm standing. I'm estimating what the weight is based on my experience with something like that before, and I'm going to plan an action associated with reaching forward and picking that up. But that is all basically unconscious processing, but it is still a cognitive process. So I think what's often, it's the case, I think, that people think of cognitive processes as being, who's the president of the United States, what day of the week is it, what's your name, declarative information.
I think he's talking about task equivalence.
So, okay, so I missed it completely.
Right, so if you're training a task, like if you have to do that task, and that's a new task that you haven't done before, if you improve that, what else is it going to improve? Or is that what you're talking about, maybe?
Related to it, I mean, it could just be a bad question, but just the relationship between physical activity and it being in the context of cognitive challenges, is it kind of like the difference between running and like being really skillful in martial arts? You have to like have a skill versus just doing the same thing over and over again?
There's a lot of evidence for task specificity in motor skill training, that I become skilled at the task that I am engaged in. That's what I was trying to get at.
So running on a treadmill versus running outside in the forest, up and down hills, even though it has similarities. Exactly.
People can look at generalizability, and often the training The specific training does generalize to other kinds of tasks, but for the most part, I think when we're talking about motor skill learning, it's practice within the context of that task. Would you agree with that, James?
Yeah, so I think, getting at this question of what is a skill, so you talk about running on a treadmill.
Yes.
People often think about that as something that is not a skill.
Mm-hmm.
But if you bring in older adults who have never walked
Right.
on a treadmill, that's
Right.
actually quite challenging.
Yeah.
So it's always the skill relative to what you already know, or what you've already experienced.
So like a skill you already do know that's become, automated. If you just also started playing chess, what is that?
So this is
While
a
you-
transfer. Yeah.
So we're talking about the relationship between, so if you're performing a cognitive task while you're doing a physical activity, that's different from just performing a physical activity, like mindlessly, right? So if the cognitive task that you're performing has nothing to do with the physical activity you're performing, it's just incidentally that you're also performing a cognitive task. What do we know what happens?
Well, one thing would be that it may facilitate my performance becoming more automatic, so that I'm allocating more resources to that cognitive task. And so if you're continually forcing me to practice under those conditions, that's the kind of neuroplastic change that we would like to see, right? That I get better at the motor task because I'm like more resources allocated.
But I think you're still alluding to transfer, right? So if you train someone to play chess while they're on the treadmill, what is that going to improve in the rest of their life? Like, yes, they'll become really good at playing chess, running the treadmill, eventually. But what is the consequence of that for other types of skill?
I guess that's exactly.
Is that what you're trying to get
That
at?
must be it.
My guess would be people have actually looked at that, and I can't think of anything right now, because again, I would imagine the training condition itself is going to promote skill acquisition in both aspects. I would imagine that there would be some translation, there'd be some carryover, but I don't know that. Again, I think one might promote the other sort of unintentionally, just because again, you're challenging me, you're forcing me to continue that motor task, doing it fluidly and doing it without error, but
It is $1 million question.
yeah, it really is. It's
Yes.
any
I
thoughts
think
about
so.
that?
There a couple of things related to that. So one is that there are a lot of people looking at how aerobic exercise affects skill learning, whether that is a motor skill that you're learning or something that's more declarative. Right? So there's, I think, a decent bit of evidence now that if you couple those things together, the aerobic activity actually promotes skill learning, promotes memory, right? So if you're going to a class and you can memorize a lot of information, if you do a short amount of walking beforehand, that can help your memory. Or if you're walking on a treadmill and studying flashcards, that can also help.
So it might create an optimum environment for learning,
Right.
that aerobic activity.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people exploring that.
Right.
But the other question is related to generalization of learning, which is the core of like the problem that we're trying to solve. If I have somebody learn in a VR environment on a treadmill or in a lab or in a clinic, does that actually help them in the real world to transfer to their normal?
Yeah.
So the general rule of thumb, I guess, is that you get transfer is greatest between tasks that are most similar. So train walking on a treadmill, it's more likely to transfer to walking on the ground than to riding a bike. And it won't transfer at all to throwing it. But so quantifying similarity between tasks.
Yeah.
There's so many factors.
Go ahead.
I have a question. So maybe if you want to conclude that, maybe I'll ask a question later.
It was just something I thought of and I forgot what it was. But Oh, things like lumosity. I mean, is there a lot of evidence that these things translate to?
It's supposed to do that.
Right. So, I mean, I think you know, however, you know, again, I'm going back to I'm looking at it in a different way, but I'm thinking about, you know, using that cognitive challenge as a way to promote acquisition of a motor skill or something like that. But that's a different thing what you're saying.
My question is, like for example, when you do exercise, like training on the treadmill, when you have, say, some kind of difficulties in that running, so let's say in a course, different courses, like different strengths that you have to, like say,
Yeah.
you know, heels and go down, and then you have to somehow engage in the program so that you can adjust your strength or your endurance sometimes. So there's just a little bit of planning while you are running, a little bit differently than just plain running in the same speed and same inclination. So if you compare that kind of exercise, physical exercise that kind of involve mental activity certain way versus another running sport, like an exercise situation that has like a physical component all the time. You have to engage your actions through that courses, adjusting your courses, like say, you know, different height you go through. You have to lower your body, and so that there are two different situations that involves different, you know, like bodily activity and mental activity. My question is, the first one, that needing endurance and then like planning, does it also correspond as a skill learning?
I absolutely 100% agree. Yes, I do. Yes, it does. And that's where I think that one of the real challenges is actually establishing that we're looking at resistance training only or aerobic training only. Because as soon as there's a goal orientation at all, like I'm going to run at a certain speed or I'm going to follow this trajectory, then it becomes a skill task. As soon as, and I think that when, you know, you look at some of these studies that have shown, like I'm thinking of Daniel Corco's resistance exercise study. Big study, big clinical trial that showed that if you do resistance training with Parkinson's disease, that improves all of these different measures that he looked at. But if you look at the methods very specifically, it wasn't just resistance to a muscle, it was moving in a very specific way. As, you know, an athletic trainer will tell you, they don't just give you weight, you have to lift the weight in a very specific way. So I think we have a real hard time saying something is just resistance or just aerobic and then this is skill. I really think as soon as you have a goal associated with performing anything, there's a skill orientation to it, which is good.
Right.
Okay, so I think getting back to our Parkinson's disease issue, what was very exciting for me, and I ended up doing a postdoc in a molecular biology lab with Michael Jakowick, who is Giselle's partner in research and life. It was fascinating to think about the concept of neuroplasticity in something like a neurodegenerative disease. All the research that I had looked at, and again, my sort of what moved me to get a PhD in the first place was looking at these more single events like a stroke or a brain injury, traumatic brain injury, but something that is a progressive neurodegenerative disorder. How can we think about neuroplasticity? But then I think, you know, I was hugely impacted by this research and, you know, what Mike had shared with me. And basically what you're looking at here is, you know, we know that Parkinson's disease, the pathophysiology associated with that is loss of dopamine producing neurons in the substantia nigra in the midbrain. right? And this on the y-axis is this percentage of neurons in the substantia nigra pars compacta over years. And what we know is that as you age, you lose dopamine-producing neurons. That's a part of normal aging. But that for some unknown reason, nobody knows why, with idiopathic Parkinson's disease, there's this accelerated loss of dopamine-producing neurons. But the fascinating thing to me, I mean, what really just excited me at the time that I was doing my postdoc in a molecular biology lab, being the worst pipetter ever, never having stepped foot into a wet lab ever, was the idea that it's not until there is a 60% loss of those neurons, which equates to about an 80% loss of dopamine in the striatum, that you see any symptoms of Parkinson's disease. That is crazy to me. 80% of a major neurotransmitter in the brain, and there's no symptoms until that point. I mean, to me, that really does tell us that the brain has some ability to compensate. And so it led to this question of, can we modulate disease progression by figuring out how to bolster those compensatory or repair processes? And so, again, not having had any experience in molecular biology, what I did have experience in was behavior. And so I brought this exercise paradigm to the lab. And we started obviously with our mouse model. And we had basically, I made sure the mice could all run. And then we had mice that were, as Giselle probably talked to you about, had basically a neurotoxin injected that selectively targets the dopamine producing neurons and produces a Parkinson-like pathophysiology with respect to loss of dopamine. And then we did this pretty high intensity treadmill running with the MPTP group and a saline injected group, and then we had no running. And did she show you this video?
Yeah, a version of this.
I
Yeah.
have a feeling. I had a feeling, even
Yeah.
though I asked her to make sure. But what again is kind of fun to see is this is our runner here, and this is our MPTP runner and our non-runner, and he just cannot get going. When I show this to a clinical group, they're all like jumping out of their chairs wanting to help this little guy, you know. But it really does show that the behavioral experience of running had some effect, and then, as you know, Mike, and at the time that I was a postdoc, we looked at, you can actually extract the brain from the mouse and actually look at the different changes that occurred. But excitingly, and this was a slide of mine that Mike had doctored. You guys know Mike at all?
No.
Jackwick?
Well, yes.
He's got quite a sense of humor, and this actually, he wanted to make sure that we, made it clear that projects that we are very, confidentiality is a critical aspect of. But anyway, what was fun for me was being able to translate this to humans. And so we, in conjunction with Giselle, we've conducted a number of studies, but utilizing really the treadmill. And we, again, the interesting part is I can't say to you it was a skill plus aerobic activity, because we didn't really specifically manipulate the skill part. But we made sure that we didn't just crank up the speed of the treadmill. Subjects had to utilize an observationally normal running or gait pattern. So they were having to process information. I mean, I can say to you, I think there was a skill component to what we were doing, aerobic plus skill.
I think you need to explain that more, because that's a very long sentence there.
Yeah. So we basically, you can think of this as what we did was we manipulated intensity of the training by essentially the target heart rate. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, we were manipulating, the cardiovascular effort or the aerobic aspect of it, right? But that wasn't really the intention. We just wanted to challenge this group at a very high level. So we utilized heart rate mostly to differentiate these groups. And so the high intensity group was one that we worked at over 24 sessions. We progressively increased their running or walking speed such that we got target heart rates of 75 to 80% maximal heart rate.
Let me ask on this. So is this between subject or within subject? In other words, were they all matched, or this is trying to increase their heart rates, like person by person overall?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
It was the only match. It was group designations, and they were only matched by age and disease severity.
Okay.
They were all within 3 years of diagnosis.
So you would get a baseline of a person, and then just slowly over time increase the intensity, just differently between the low and high intensity groups.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and this was based on, and I think it's an important thing to point out. I looked at over 50 years of exercise studies that were done in Parkinson's disease when I developed this trial, and they basically very, very low level, very minimally challenging types of activities. They include some balance, a lot of passive range of motion, some strengthening, some functional activities like sit-to-stand, but it was very minimally challenging and low level. So we basically had them working at these different kinds of tasks, but keeping at a heart rate below 50%. So it wasn't intensive in that respect. What the point I was trying to make here is that, like I said, I believe that we were utilizing a paradigm where we were training them aerobically, but the skill component was that we only increased the speed of the treadmill when they were capable of moving with this observationally normal pattern, either running or walking.
So as soon as they got better at walking, and I'm assuming, probably their heart rate recovered a little bit, but really they had to get better at walking in terms of your visual inspection of it, then you ramp them up.
Yeah.
Okay.
And these are, so these are not people like the gentleman who saw the video.
Mm-hmm.
They're walking from, basically you would all look at that person and say there's nothing wrong with them. That's what we were after in terms of their movement.
Okay.
And they have that capability. Mm-hmm. And that was actually probably our most exciting finding. Again, I don't know how much you know, but it's been a fairly recent occurrence that Parkinson's disease that is not at this end stage, like people diagnosed with the disease are referred to physical therapy. That is very, very new. It wasn't until very recently that that Parkinson's disease would be considered a rehabilitation entity at all. It was more, you see people when they're in wheelchairs, unable to move, and it was more about training their family how to deal with them. And now, and I think our work and others, I'm really proud of the fact that now it is people are referred for intense exercise and physical therapy immediately on diagnosis. When again, observationally, you might not detect that there's even a problem.
That's the question here. So,
Yeah.
did you, in order to get people to the point where they were able to maintain that heart rate for an hour, how long does it take? Presumably, some of these people were sedentary. beforehand? Do you just, how do you rank people
Yeah.
to that level?
Well, there's a couple of, the first part of that is we had that as an exclusion criteria. They had to be sedentary. We got rid of that one real fast.
So those people were excluded.
Okay.
But they were initially, but then we couldn't, the people interested in being a part of this research are people that are exercising and believe in exercise. So they weren't necessarily sedentary.
Okay.
And what we basically controlled for was don't change your exercise routine, whatever it is, keep it the same. And we documented real specifically what it was. It wasn't like we had marathon runners, but we weren't.
I'm just
We had
thinking
people
about,
that definitely believed in exercise.
you're doing
but-
like 6 miles.
It would
Yeah.
take, you would need like another 24 sessions just to get them to the minimum.
Right.
It was pretty remarkable how, this was over 24 sessions, so I don't know exactly like for a given subject necessarily, but we got people, I can't run at 8 miles an hour. And we had people that were like 78 years old. So, we had people that we had quite a range from young onset, people with young onset Parkinson's that were like late 30s or early 40s to people that were 78, 80 years old. And so it was pretty amazing to see what they were capable of if you just pushed them and they were motivated to do it. But we had people that were on I can't think of the drug right now, but we had people that that would dampen their heart rate increase. Anyway, so we'd have to look at other like rate of perceived exertion as a way of being able to increase the intensity. Because a lot of people had, like secondary cardiovascular
They were
problems, and they were on blood pressure medications, or I can't think of the drug right now. But so it wasn't always heart rate that we could utilize as a way to ramp it up. But we were pretty excited. Yeah, 60% of the individuals in our high exercise, high intensity group, got to this point of being able to run. For basically it was a 50-minute 50 minutes each session. They had a little bit of warm up and cool down, but they were on the treadmill for close to an hour. You guys doing okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so we also were able to assess changes in the brain with TMS. And again, Giselle likely talked to you about this. The research world in Parkinson's disease has focused very much on this nigrostriatal system, the substantia nigro, where the dopamine neurons are. There's cell loss, there's apoptosis. We should focus in on what we can do to keep those cells alive. But what Giselle what Mike and the lab that I worked at really focused a lot on was, well, what happens in terms of particularly higher level processing when you have limited dopamine? What's happening downstream? What's happening in the cortex? And Giselle probably talked a lot about that, right? So again, we could focus, it's not to say I don't want to protect neurons from dying, but what we know is that when people with Parkinson's disease, upon autopsy, what you can see is that they still have sometimes 40 to 60% of dopamine producing neurons still there. So progression of the disease is not progressive loss of dopamine producing neurons. There's a lot of changes in how dopamine is utilized downstream in terms of the corticostriatal pathway and, the ventral tegmental areas and other parts of the brain that are utilizing dopamine as the primary neurotransmitter. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that has been seen is that when you're looking at the corticostriatal pathway in particular, what dopamine is doing is it is modulating glutamate. Glutamate is the key neurotransmitter in the cortex. And dopamine is basically saying, putting up a stop sign, putting up a go sign. It's modulating what glutamate's doing. That's what it is. It's a modulator. And what is seen is that when there's less dopamine available, glutamate sort of goes unchecked. And a signature of Parkinson's disease pathology is actually hyperexcitability of the cortex, the corticostriatal pathway. It becomes hyperexcitable because glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, is sort of going unchecked. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so that is a key signature that you can consistently measure in people with Parkinson's disease using TMS, is you can see a measure of this hyperexcitability. And it has been established that hyperexcitable state actually underlies a lot of the pathology and cardinal symptoms that we associate with Parkinson's disease. So yes, there's loss of dopamine, but you want to look at what is the impact of that downstream.
So things like impatience and impulse control behaviorally.
Right.
Right?
And so this was our basic data acquisition for TMS. This is the non-funded poor person's version of an active contraction experiment where you're using a blood pressure cuff and you're having people contract. In this case, it was the first dorsal interosseous muscle. And we're just having them contract to a certain level, contract, stimulate, and then looking at, again, the excitability measures. Now, the active contraction condition in TMS gives us another measure besides the motor evoked potential. It gives us something called the cortical silent period, the cortical silent period duration, which we know is essentially a measure of inhibitory circuits. There have been a lot of studies that have looked at GABA B inhibitors, and it is entirely related to inhibitory circuits in the brain. What is seen, and as I said, a very, very consistent signature in Parkinson's disease is a shortened silent period duration, which would be a measure of hyperexcitability, right? As CSP represents inhibitory influences on cortical motor excitability, higher excitability would be evident as a shortened silent period duration. Does that make sense? So, and this again is something that's consistently seen in the TMS literature, and it's nice to have, I would love to have a TMS part of our study somehow, but it's nice to have this very, very precise and very consistent signature of pathology in PD that we could, look at how our intervention affects that. But as I said, yeah, so it's one of the most consistent and widely reproduced TMS findings. And this is what's very important, is that it's seen that when with dopamine replacement therapy or surgical deep brain stimulation, it's associated with lengthening of the silent period duration towards levels seen in control subjects. So it definitely has a role in behavior, right? The shortened silent duration. So this is back to our data with our high intensity study, and we basically allowed people to volunteer for the TMS part. We wouldn't do that anymore. So we have fewer subjects, but we were able to show that every single one of our subjects that underwent high intensity training, I'm going to say aerobic plus skill training, showed an increase in silent period duration. You know, we didn't have enough subjects to really run inferential statistics. This was very real data, this person. So the mean is somewhat meaningless, but we were able to show an increase in CSP with every single subject that underwent high intensity training. So if you look at, this is that same guy going through the same door, 12 sessions of very high intensive physical therapy. Maybe you don't think it's a normal gait pattern, but it's pretty impressive, yeah? Don't tell me you've seen this. You have? When did you see it?
Last time
I've seen it more times though, but I love seeing it because every time you see it, you notice something different about the walking,
But I
which is
specifically
significant.
asked Giselle, did you talk about exercise? Did you show Bernie's video? Because
I
this
know,
is
but
actually-
both of you explain it completely different
Okay.
though. So
Mhm.
for us, we get something to,
I
because
see.
she didn't talk about CSB at all.
Okay.
At all. So for us, that's completely new information.
It's also more footage of the same.
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, again, what I really like about this is here he is. He's like, hey, come on, what's taking you guys so long? He's turning around. He's waiting. He's gonna go back. He's gonna, yeah, I'm over there. I'm just gonna head over here right now. It's really, I just see this. Bernie's just not thinking about his walking. He's thinking about where his car is, and he's getting over to it.
Can tend to you, right? And where are you, right?
Yeah,
That turning around.
right. He's right. He's interacting with
Multitasking.
people in his environment. It's like completely different.
What would,
Yeah, the
what
difference
would
is so
freezing
strange.
look like if he froze at a moment? Like, would just stop?
So you saw it, yeah.
Okay.
It's just
You saw a little bit
You
before.
saw a little bit
Before
when you
he
were going through the
turns.
door. I mean, let me do this again,
Yeah.
just because again, I think what's really fun actually is to look at.
It's crazy. He's not even shuffling or anything.
No, and
It's pointing a lot.
now let me ask you a question. I mean, nobody brought this up in this group. Anyway, what did we look at as our measure of cortical spinal or cortical silent period duration? What muscle did we utilize?
The one in the hand, right?
Hand muscle. What does that have to do with high intensity treadmill training? So it sort of gets to what you were talking about. I mean, it's really to see this generalized effect in the brain in a hand muscle when the training was gait specific. I mean, to me, that says something about this kind of, again, it's not so much the skill transfer that you were asking about, but to see a change in the brain that generalizes regardless of what body part you're testing. So I missed that again. Anyway, it was like,
Yeah,
That was it.
we're seeing, there's,
yeah, it's just when you see him go through the doors, it's really different. And it's interesting, again, seeing it 55 times, you start to notice that somebody else actually comes through the door at the same time. It really, it impacts his performance when pre. But afterwards, it's only in the pre, I think.
So when we were talking about triggers for freezing, doorways in particular were one of them, and I was just wondering what exactly about like an entryway causes that. Because I know they say the same thing about memory, like that feeling when you enter a room and you can't remember why you were there is like directly triggered by the entrance.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, we really don't know. Is it, because it's not necessarily that the doorway narrows a great deal.
Right.
It's not necessarily
It's not that the
anything like that. I
environment is
think it's
varying.
just that change in
It could be the
environment.
anticipation of the change,
Right.
right? Because we're
Okay.
we're always from a very young age, like we've learned about doorways that they bring you somewhere else, and so
yeah,
Just for the whole
maybe.
affordances thing, I mean, doorways are one of the best examples
Yeah.
of phenomenal
yes,
affordances.
absolutely,
You see it a lot with turning too.
yeah.
So it is some kind of change in terms of.
I mean, we use it. What Patrick's alluding to for people who design user interfaces, right, or even just artists, right? For a doorway is a symbol that is so like recognizable as a transition or a thing that you maybe should open or think about going through or not. Like it's a transitional object that is very meaningful to people.
But like, I think also it's invisible,
Yes.
like to people who don't need to deliberate,
Yeah.
which is important.
But again, I think about a doorway, or I think about, my goal is to get to the elevator, right? That's my environmental goal.
The architect, though, thought about how to get you to
Yeah.
that, right?
But I utilize information visually in advance. I use it to make predictions and to plan my action in advance. And I think that's where, again, you'll see people with Parkinson's disease that aren't engaging in that. Their movement is just so based on the processing they're doing at that moment in time. And I don't want us to promote that. I think it is just overuse of the same system that they're already relying on. You see, they're already relying on a cognitive system.
Can you open for James? The question is whether by putting people in some sort of hypnotic vortex of doors that keep changing shape, like could you just bring that back, that automaticity of just like I'm going through doors, like if you just have different kinds of doors at different types of moments,
Right.
there's so many questions about that task performance of retraining them to ignore the affordance, within quotations, or just not like stop and think about it versus when you actually do need to think about it. Because if you have a glass door, like you don't want it to go through it, right?
Yeah.
So, yes.
I've worked, so put my clinician hat back on, I've worked with enough patients over my career that it's not, they automatically figure out how to get the job done in compensatory ways. Now, I'm not saying those are always effective ways, but I think the compensation to utilize cognitive processes for movement is something that people naturally do with Parkinson's disease. I think that may be what's underlying freezing in the first place, and then we address it, as James was saying, I love that, we address it by basically compounding that same process. And I think what we need to be getting at is bringing up that automatic system and that capability that is not gone. I think it's just a compensation the brain makes automatically.
Do you think that during that initial decline in, the fact that we don't observe the symptoms until you lost something like 80% of the growth, do you think that during that time there's this gradual shift from automatic to cognitive? So the behavior itself looks the same, but it's controlled completely differently. And that it might even be possible to probe that by giving people a task and sort of just ramping up the cognitive load. So you would expect that in the early phases you need a very heavy cognitive load until you see a performance decrement. But as the dopamine decays, that added cognitive load that you need to see that decrement is smaller.
Yeah.
So, is it possible that could be a way to actually do sort of earlier detection? So pushing the system to its boundary more.
Right. Unfortunately, there's no biomarker that says, oh, you're going to get Parkinson's disease, and we could start it then. But I think that would be,
It'd be
absolutely,
interesting if you
yes.
had sort of a normal, you need some sort of evaluation that you do in a huge population.
You'd have to have baselines,
Yeah.
like just like in Alzheimer's, every 6 months you
Right.
can test to the same tasks, see how bad they're getting at them.
But I think that's why, I mean, it does. It seems like it's this new hot topic, is that that the cognitive deficits may actually predate even the cardinal motor symptoms that Giselle talked about, right, last week. But I think when you think about it, it's not such an unusual or new concept. I mean, I think that it's happening. That's how they are. Exactly. That's how they're appearing absolutely normal physically. And so you start to probe that, those cognitive deficits. And
Vishta, you had a question?
Yes. About CSP, cortical scientific evaluation. During this period, I was confused about one thing. Does the whole communication between, like in the brain and the neurons around the body, does it all stop totally, or is it like still continues but lesser?
Okay, I'm so good at not getting the questions exactly right and then going off in a different direction. So please stop me if I'm not answering this correctly. In the TMS world, we would like nothing better than to connect a specific finding with behavior, and it's really impossible to do that. So it's not to say that that cortical silent period is the reason why people freeze, for example.
It's an association, not a causation.
We can't really make that we can't draw that kind of conclusion. We do know from the flip side that if you give people dopamine replacement, or or deep brain stimulation, you do see improvement in certain, like the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale. You'll see changes in bradykinesia, and so it definitely seems to be related.
I
the
think
silent period duration will increase as you see behavioral improvement, but we can't
It's not
say it's
silent across
correlated.
all circuits. I think maybe that's what you're asking,
Yeah.
right? Right? It's just in that particular place where you're looking at, right? Which is, tell us the region again. Like what are you looking at?
Specifically, you're looking at motor cortex.
Yeah, so it's in the motor cortex. There is that resting period change.
With an active contraction. Think of it like
and it's task specific also, right? So it's very super specific kind of measurement. So yeah.
So when you talk about the hyper excitability of the cortex, then cortex is motor cortex only, or?
As far as I know, there's only been measurements in motor cortex in terms of the cortical striatal pathway. I don't know that people have looked at hyperexcitability in like prefrontal cortex or anything like that. I think just motor.
Because that's what came to my mind first. I'm sorry.
No, so there's fMRI evidence of the hyperexcitability or hyperperfusion of
other areas.
So this silent period is just
or something.
It's just a way for us to measure a change it's not. So what I'm saying, it's correlation, not causation, is that Parkinson's is not CSP, like a silent period. It has nothing to do with that. It's just it produces that, and you can change that, which somehow correlates also with other symptoms or other aspects of Parkinson's. So for us, since we can't measure like a global phenomenon of Parkinson's, there's this narrow window into a thing that produces a very particular signal that if it tells us something about, the task performance change. I don't know if that makes better sense. Yes, maybe? Okay.
We do think I mean, from our animal work, what we think is happening is that exercise has an effect on modifying not how much dopamine is there. We don't see any increase in dopamine. What we see is how dopamine is used. It's like there's less dopamine, so keep it out there in the synapse longer and let it work longer rather than reuptake, taking it back up into the dopamine, the presynaptic neuron. The dopamine neurotransmission is modified by exercise, and that seems to impact how dopamine is able to then modulate glutamate. So you see overall evidence of decreased excitability, one of those being that of lengthened silent period duration. And it definitely has an impact on behavior, but we can't say one-to-one this relates to this, or
It's hard to create a reduced model,
Yeah.
so that you can measure it and track it over time. It's just so difficult.
And I also didn't understand how does glutamate contribute in all this? It's not like-
glutamate is the key excitatory neurotransmitter in your cortex.
Okay.
Basically, being able to move has to do with,
Glutamate.
yeah,
And dopamine,
modulates that.
They work
How much-
together.
Yeah, they work together. Dopamine is an actually inhibitory neurotransmitter, but it's modulating glutamate.
So one's exciting things, and the other one is like pushing things in and out, right? So you need both of them have to dance together.
Yeah,
So if there's less of one, the other is not, going to work as well.
and I think it's particularly, I think one of the things that we found, which I thought was particularly important, and I thought it was a good thing, is that the exercise wasn't changing dopamine levels. It wasn't changing the amount of dopamine. The focus of intervention has been, okay, we've got decreased dopamine producing neurons, let's just replace dopamine. And if we're not saying it isn't effective particularly for a period of time, but we haven't been looking at what is kind of this downstream effect of limited dopamine and how it's not able to dance with these other neurotransmitters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Speed. So one of the things I already talked about this really is that I think one of the great things that's happened in a very short time is the work that we've done and other groups that are doing work in exercise and our group in BKN and here is really the focus on emphasizing challenging impaired systems like in the stroke model rather than just helping people adjust as they get worse. The training is intensive, people are seen earlier. And this is always the favorite response I get from mostly MDs when I've talked about these things at Society for Neuroscience meeting. It's not a cure, exercise. There is this new awareness, but this is my favorite response. But the benefits only last as long as people are exercising. And, I get that kind of, and I'm always puzzled by that comment because that's pretty much true for everyone, right? I don't think that's just, so what is critical, so again, we've sort of taken all of our animal work and human work together, sort of come to this recognition that it seems to be exercise that incorporate goal-directed practice and aerobic training may work synergistically to facilitate neuroplasticity necessary for overcoming aberrant circuitry in the basal ganglia. So it seems to be a combination of the appropriate brain environment with aerobic exercise, but then this skill acquisition piece. So getting to that, my question then to you, this is, I think, what our goal is. How can we use a VR environment to build in both aerobic and skill components into a walking environment, but critically promote a lifelong commitment to practice, to exercise. This is definitely something that people need to modify their life. It's not, their exercise is effective, or practice is effective, but the benefits only last as long as you're practicing and moving. So I think it's not just about building in aerobic and skill components, it's making it motivating, it's making it something that someone values, so that they make this lifelong commitment.
So for us, there's, at this level of work that we do, there's two ways that really we use the VR. When there's multiple ways, but one, with all types of interventions, seeing the long-term benefits takes very long time, and therefore we often use interactive entertainment as a way to bridge that. So to make the task more pleasurable,
Right.
so people who will do it long enough to see the long-term benefits, and then not necessarily needs the interactive entertainment to do it. They will find other ways, because most people cannot have a treadmill VR system at their house. I mean, we fantasize about that, but the truth is, most exercise equipment at home is really good for hanging your clothes, right? So it's kind of, your bridge to get people to do something, and enjoy doing it, see the benefits of
maybe inherent
it.
in the environment itself.
Yeah, early on,
Yeah.
that's how we use stuff, and also for teaching them how to do something that they
Right.
might want to repeat on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So we have really good success with that. It's harder to think about the lifelong commitment as a replication of what you've brought them in to do. So, in other words, it's like when you're in school and you're made to read, and you read different stuff, and you discuss literature and do all this sort of things. You do that not to teach people necessarily how to read, except you do that very early on, but it's to promote a love for literature. And so then people can leave and go to Amazon or the bookstore or a book club, however they will pursue their love for literature. But our task is sort of very early here, in that we have to create an experience that will make people love trying to do more of this, because it can help them.
Yeah.
And we can answer some basic science questions through this platform in terms of context and learning and all kinds of other stuff that we don't have any answers for at the moment.
So it's like, is it like designing a VR environment where participants have develop this thinking tool, way of thinking about doors, such that when they get out of the VR, every door looks like a fortress, because they've thought about them enough.
That's one direction.
But that's the kind of thing that you're talking about?
It could be that, but here's another thing. In the locomotion lab, or locomotor lab is, I guess, your title for it. You have a treadmill. You didn't show pictures of your lab.
Yeah, I just pulled a video really quick.
You need to see the task that we're initially challenged with, like how it's done right now, which we haven't shown. Because that's our experimental environment, is this treadmill with a harness, because people fall, plus VR, right? So we have to get people to walk, and then possibly run, and then deal with all kinds of other stuff, potentially, in the virtual environment. Do you want to show it?
This is just, you guys see the screen. So this is just the our current prototype. Just to give an example of someone walking on our treadmill, wearing, this is the Oculus, and this is one of the environments.